On the last days of March 1964, Brazil looked like it was sliding into chaos. Troops were moving, elites were panicking, and rumors of a coup moved faster than the newspapers could print them. Off the coast, far from the streets of Rio and São Paulo, another kind of movement was quietly beginning. Fuel tankers were being readied in Aruba. A naval task force, including an aircraft carrier and destroyers, was told to prepare to head towards Brazilian waters under the cover of routine exercises. In Washington, officials were assembling plans to fly more than 100 tons of ammunition and light equipment to Brazil within a day if needed. All of this was part of a single operation with a bland name, Brother Sam. Publicly, the United States claimed it was defending democracy against a dangerous drift towards dictatorship. Privately, it was preparing to help remove Brazil's elected president, as long as his opponents could produce a successor who looked legitimate on paper. The rule was simple. To save Brazil from an authoritarian future, Washington had to prevent one man, President João Goulart, from staying in power. Welcome to Dank. Join me. Let's see a bigger world. In early 1964, Brazil was a country of extremes. Inflation was eating away salaries and savings. Economic confidence was collapsing. Politics was divided between a reformist left that wanted to rewrite the social contract and conservative forces in business, the military, and the Catholic Church who believed the country was being dragged towards chaos, or worse, communism. In the middle of this storm stood President João Goulart. He was the constitutional president of the Republic, who had reached office through Brazil's own political system. But he had decided that the system needed deep change. Goulart called his plan basic reforms. He wanted stronger protections for rural workers. He wanted agrarian reform so that large estates could be broken up and land could be redistributed under law. He wanted broader voting rights. He wanted a bigger role for the state in the economy, including more control over sectors like oil. To his supporters, this was overdue modernization in a deeply unequal country. To many on the right, these measures looked like the first steps towards a left-wing authoritarian project. American officials had been watching Brazil with increasing concern. This was the Cold War. In Washington, almost every political crisis in the global South was read through the lens of a larger struggle with the Soviet Union and international communism. 2 years earlier, in October 1962, U.S. policymakers had already written a strategy paper on Brazil. The objectives were threefold. First, to promote democratically oriented forces who could restrain Goulart and limit his ability to push reforms too far. Second, to strengthen the Brazilian military's pro-U.S. orientation, making sure that key officers saw their interests aligned with Washington. Third, to facilitate the most favorable possible succession if a crisis made Goulart's removal likely. The problem was a political system they feared could drift towards a government they would not accept. The solution they were planning was a managed succession. If a crisis came, make sure the next leader was someone they could trust, and make sure the military had the confidence to act. For a time, this remained background planning. But by late March 1964, the mood in Washington hardened. The turning point came in a cable from the U.S. ambassador in Rio, Lincoln Gordon, dated March 28, 1964. Up to that point, Goulart's presidency could still be described as turbulent but constitutional. He used rallies, decrees, and pressure on Congress, but the basic institutions of democracy were still in place. Gordon chose to give Washington a different interpretation. In his cable, he wrote that Goulart was definitely engaged in a campaign to seize dictatorial power. He warned that Brazil could come under full communist control. He estimated that a return to normal constitutional politics was now less than a 50-50 outcome. Most importantly, he offered a specific diagnosis. He said that what Goulart was doing, threatening the opposition media, using state resources to build support, applying pressure on Congress, encouraging mobilized street pressure from below, should be understood as a coup from the top down. In that phrase, the entire framing of the crisis shifted. If Goulart was carrying out a coup from above, then moves against him could be described not as an attack on democracy, but as a defense of it. This was the key move in the system Washington was building. The rule was set. Brazil had to be kept in the free world, and stopping Goulart now counted as a way to obey that rule. What followed would be justified as prevention, not overthrow. 3 days later, on March 30th, 1964, Secretary of State Dean Rusk briefed President Lyndon Johnson. He told Johnson that resistance to Goulart was building fast among key governors and among officers in the armed forces, especially in important eastern states. Johnson's reply cut to the core of Washington's priorities. He wanted two things. First, that Brazil must not go communist. Second, that the United States should support somebody legitimate in Goulart's place. Those words, somebody legitimate, were not just casual. They became the central condition for American help. Washington was not planning a classic invasion. There would be no public declaration of war, no Marines landing on the beaches. Instead, they would prepare fuel, ships, and ammunition as contingency support, but only for Brazilian actors who could present themselves as lawful. If the anti-Goulart forces could install a successor who, on paper, fit within the Constitution, a senior figure like the President of the Chamber of Deputies or the head of the Senate, then Washington could claim that it was recognizing a legal transition. Behind that language, the reality could be very different. But the word legitimate would act as the bridge between a military move and international acceptance. In this way, the idea of legitimacy was turned into an instrument. It became the key that would unlock American support. On the morning of March 31st, 1964, the U.S. Embassy in Rio sent a short message to Washington. It said that the balloon has gone up in Minas Gerais. General Olímpio Mourão Filho had begun moving troops from that state towards Rio de Janeiro, openly challenging Goulart. Within hours, Washington moved from planning to activation. In a telegram often cited by historians, known as Telegram 1301, U.S. officials laid out the steps of what they now called Operation Brother Sam. First, U.S. Navy tankers loaded with fuel would sail from Aruba towards Brazil. Second, a naval task force, including an aircraft carrier and destroyers, would head in the same direction, under the cover of routine exercises. Third, more than 110 tons of ammunition and light equipment would be assembled for an airlift to Sao Paulo. The telegram stated that fuel could not be unloaded and weapons could not be flown in until there was a political military situation in which a group with a reasonable claim to legitimacy could formally request U.S. recognition and aid. As troops moved across Brazil, Goulart tried to resist. He traveled from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia. He tried to rally loyal units, but the momentum was against him. Key commanders refused to obey. Political figures in Brasilia began to treat his absence as abandonment. In one of the most consequential moves of the crisis, Congress declared the presidency vacant. This was a legal fiction. Goulart was still in the country. He had not resigned. He had not been impeached. But declaring the office vacant allowed legislators to move quickly to install a new leadership that would be acceptable to the armed forces. Within days, the military consolidated its control. Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco, the Army Chief of Staff, emerged as the central figure. He would soon become the first president of the new regime. For Operation Brother Sam, something interesting happened. The most dramatic parts of the plan, the offloading of fuel, the delivery of ammunition, were never actually carried out. From a distance, it could even look as if the operation had been unnecessary. But inside the system that had been built, the operation had already done its political work. The knowledge that Washington had fuel, ships, and weapons on standby sent a signal to anti-Goulart forces. It told them that if they moved, they would not be isolated. It reassured nervous officers and conservative civilians that the United States preferred their victory. And once a new government stood up in Brasilia with a reasonable claim to legitimacy, Washington could quickly recognize it. In that sense, the contingency plan functioned like a guarantee, not a public guarantee to Brazil's voters, but a quiet guarantee to those preparing to remove their president. Within weeks of the coup, U.S. officials privately acknowledged that there were serious questions about what had happened. One internal report described the doubtful legality of Goulart's ouster. Congress had declared the presidency vacant even though he was still on Brazilian soil. But at the level of policy, those doubts mattered less than the sense of relief. The feared coup from the top down had been stopped. The new military-backed government signaled that it would block the more radical elements of Goulart's basic reforms. It promised a harder line against communism and left-wing movements. It reassured foreign investors. From Washington's point of view, the rule had been obeyed. Brazil had not gone communist. That was the apparent success. The backfire would unfold over the next 2 decades. The new regime did not act as a temporary guardian of democracy. It became a military dictatorship. Elections were controlled and constrained. Opponents were arrested, exiled, or forced into silence. Censorship grew. Torture was used systematically against suspected dissidents. Brazil's institutional life was reshaped around the needs of the armed forces and the security apparatus. The same system that had been justified as a defense against an imagined future dictatorship produced a very real one in the present that lasted for 21 years.